Good afternoon and welcome to the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership webinar, Walleye Habitat, Considerations for Successful Natural Reproduction and Stocking. I'm Jo Lattimore from Michigan State University and part of the Education and Outreach Committee for the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership. And I'd like to share a little information about the partnership and logistics for the webinar before we get started with our presentation. The Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership hosts these lake conservation webinars to share science, management, and outreach efforts of interest to our partners. You can keep up to date with our webinars by checking out the webinar page at midwestglaciallakes.org. Webinars in the series will be added to our webpage alongside other webinars of interest. We have 20 webinars lined up for this year. Notifications for the webinars will also be provided through the MGLP quarterly newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter on our website. And if you'd like to share your experience or project results through a webinar like this, please reach out to Joe Noner. And Joe's contact information is on the slide there in front of you. It's nonerj@michigan.gov. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership, we're a partnership of professionals and stakeholders focused on conserving the over 40,000 glacially formed inland lakes across an 8-state region. Our mission is to protect, rehabilitate, and enhance sustainable fish habitats in glacial lakes of the Midwest for the use and the enjoyment of current and future generations. The partnership provides science for lake conservation, such as our Conservation Planner tool that provides information about every lake in the partnership area. We provide outreach and education to stakeholders and to professionals through these webinars, news releases, Twitter conversations, and sharing of materials related to lake conservation. And we provide funding for science, outreach, and education, as well as on-the-ground rehabilitation and protection projects through our Lakes Conservation Grant. This annual grant provides about $300,000 for lake conservation projects that benefit fishes. Today's presentation should last about 30 to 45 minutes, and we'll hold remaining time for questions. Participants are all muted during this webinar. So if you have questions, please use the question and answer function found in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit them. I'll be moderating those questions and we'll try to get to them all during the time that we have together. If for some reason you have technical difficulties, or if you'd like to share this webinar with others who couldn't attend today, we will post a video of the webinars to our webpage within a week or so. All right, let's move on to today's speaker. We're excited to welcome Dr. Joshua Raabe today. Dr. Raabe is an associate professor of fisheries and aquatic sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. He's been at Stevens Point since 2014 and primarily teaches life history of fishes, fish population dynamics, and fisheries research. His research interests include fish habitat, movement and migrations, passage and survival, along with trying novel techniques. He earned his PhD from North Carolina State University, where he studied dam removals and then a nature-like fishway as a postdoc. And he obtained his master's from UW-Stevens Point, studying walleye spawning habitat. Josh enjoys advising the American Fisheries Society student subunit, fly fishing, bow hunting, sports, music, and spending time with his wife, 2 children, and dog, especially in the outdoors. So with that, no more ado, Josh, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Joe, for the introduction, and also thank you for this opportunity to talk to you today about walleye habitat. That picture there is actually one I caught up in the UP of Michigan on Lake Gogebic. Given that this is the Midwest Glacial Lakes, what I'm focusing on is walleye habitat in these inland lakes. So not in river settings, not in reservoirs, and not in the Great Lakes. And really what I want to do today is just summarize a lot of the great studies that are out there and give some information on maybe some areas that we could go with future research. So walleye are an important top predator in all the systems that they occupy, but also they're highly targeted and often harvested. And so this does mean that lots of times they do need more management than some species that are not as harvest orientated, such as bass. Another big challenge is they have naturally variable recruitment. And so, even in the best systems, the populations go up and down. And this is for a few different reasons. One is walleye are broadcast spawners, meaning they deposit their eggs in a relatively larger area, and then they leave. They don't have any parental care like something like a bass does. But another thing is they are known to be quite density dependent, including even cannibalizing each other. And so that's another reason why it's really driven by these strong year classes moving through. Another challenge or a big concern is, especially in these our smaller lake systems, in the Midwest here, we're seeing declining recruitment and in turn declining abundance. This image here is from Wisconsin natural reproduction lakes. The graph on top represents recruits. And so what the DNR does here is go out and sample using electrofishing in the fall and looking for age 0 and use that as our recruitment metric. We can see that over time from the 1990s to the mid 2015 or so, there's been a significant decline in recruitment. We also see this in lakes that we consider to be strong walleye lakes. So 3 adults per acre or more is what the DNR uses as a really good walleye lake. And we've seen a decline in the proportion of these natural reproduction lakes that are meeting that criteria. When we look at it, just how is the walleye lakes, how are they supported? Natural recruitment is black. The gray is a combination of natural recruitment and stocking, and the dash gray is stocking only. I think the most obvious is the strong decline in natural recruitment only, which was 60% or more in the 90s, and now it's hovering more 30 to 45%. We see an increase in lakes that are stocking only, and a little bit of an increase in those combination lakes as well. Some of this is plateaued, or we're maybe seeing a little bit of a shift with natural recruitment picking up. But a concern in these lakes is, it's not just that they're supported by this or that, but we're seeing changes in the production, which is the top row of graphs. Production means new growth of biomass, but also of new individuals coming into the population. Whereas on the bottom row, this is just the biomass, the weight of the whole population. The blue line, the blue dots represent the natural recruitment lakes. And we can see there really has not been much change in production or biomass over time. But that's not what we're seeing. With combination lakes, we're seeing a decline, and we're seeing an even stronger decline with the lakes that are stocked only. Now, this isn't a problem just in Wisconsin. It also is an issue in other areas. A pretty famous one is Mille in Minnesota, a really large, popular walleye lake where they've seen the abundance of walleye go down considerably, where it peaked maybe around 3 million in the 1990s, and now it's at times well below 1 million, age 3 and older adults. And not too surprising, but this has also shown up in the harvest, where the harvest has noticeably declined over time. And this obviously then gets anglers, pretty concerned, but also managers concerned. And it's, these clear declines in abundance and recruitment has led to some pretty extreme management actions, where Mille has gone through periods where there's complete moratoriums, and same with the Minocqua chain of Wisconsin, which is a huge tourist area. Some of these moratoriums just may be no harvest. Others are, you really aren't even supposed to be targeting the walleye whatsoever. And so, an obvious kind of question is, well, what's causing this? Or is it just a cyclical aspect and maybe it'll bounce back up? Walleye populations, as we saw, do go through cyclical up and down periods. However, the big concern is when we're just really losing natural recruitment altogether. So the natural reproduction is not, existent in some of these lakes. That's where there's the big concern. And it's gone over multiple time periods now. Keep in mind, this is, for the most part, geared a little bit more towards some of our smaller lakes. But as Mille shows, it can happen in large lakes as well. And so the question is, well, what's causing this? And there's lots of theories and lots of areas of research. Is it something to do with changing environmental conditions? Maybe it's other species. What about the prey? What about habitat degradation? Or maybe it's the fishing that's the problem. As I mentioned, these are all areas of research, and I'll touch on some of these, but also some of them are areas for further research or just something I won't be able to quite get to today. But I think what we need to do before looking at these specifically is take a step back, okay, and think about that walleye actually are native to large rivers and lakes. So as the glaciers receded, that's where they were successful, and that's where they are really adapted to, are these large rivers and lakes. Now, they're pretty much ubiquitous across a lot of our landscape, but that's because of us, right? And so we've introduced and then maintained many other lakes with stocking. Okay, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but there's a question of, well, where should walleye be? Where is it worthwhile to spend our time and our resources, right? Because across the Midwest, we have lots of different lakes. And again, a lot of lake associations want walleye, but should we necessarily be managing for them in every system? And so that goes to, well, what do walleye need? And number one is just access, whether it was natural or through stocking. So again, I'm not saying that just because a lake was stocked that we should never manage for walleye. In fact, some of the best lakes actually were ones where walleye were introduced. A great example of that is Escanaba Lake in northern Wisconsin. It's one of the most studied walleye lakes in the world, but also it's one of the most productive walleye lakes, and they were really introduced, and it took a few stockings for it to actually take hold. Next, though, is they're in there. Are they going to be successful? We have to consider the water quality, okay? And is that water quality suitable for them to survive and complete their life stages? But ideally, is it optimal for them? The next aspect, I think, when we think of habitat, I think we often jump to the physical habitat, but that water quality is super, super important. And so the physical habitat, this is things like, structure and cover and all those things. That's important from the egg to the adult stage. And so we shouldn't focus just on one aspect, but we really should look at throughout their life stages. And then we can't, forget other species. Walleye obviously need to eat. So what is the prey base? But then there's going to be competitors and potential predators of walleye. And we really have to consider those things as well. So what I'm gonna do is just give an overview of these couple different things with the water quality and the physical habitat and species interactions, and then go through a bunch of different studies that have looked at these. Talk about some other research aspects and some management approaches, and a little bit about stocking right at the end. So water quality, as I mentioned, this is absolutely critical because it's going to influence survival, metabolism, everything is going to be influenced by the water quality. What lots of studies have found is that walleye can be present in quite a few different lakes, but there's certain aspects that make them much more successful. One of the most clear is productivity. And so walleye are present in oligotrophic lakes all the way through eutrophic systems, but by and large, they are most successful in that intermediate, that mesotrophic productivity. The next is temperature. Temperature is absolutely critical for fish as they're cold-blooded, and walleye fall into the cool water aspect. And there's times where it may get too hot for them to survive. It actually could be lethal. And so there's varying studies, but somewhere, 27 to 31 degrees Celsius is starting to get too hot. But then we kind of move on to reproduction and growth. And so for growth, walleye are most successful when temperatures are about 18 to 24 degrees Celsius in that spring through fall period. That's where the growth really can occur. And so not too hot, but also not too cold for growth. But an interesting thing too is that it does have to get cold in the winter. And so it actually has to get below 12 degrees Celsius for the gonadal development to be successful. And so probably not gonna be a problem here in Wisconsin and the Midwest at this point, but in southern areas, that can actually be a limiting factor for walleye reproduction. Walleye are very sensitive to light. In their retinum, they have what's called a tapetum lucidum, which is basically this structure that allows them to collect a lot of light at low light, and this is why they're very effective at feeding at night. So if you were to measure actual light or the optical habitat, it's 8 to 86 lux. I think that's one we're not really measuring too often, or one that we're super familiar with. And so a nice kind of surrogate is clarity and Secchi disc, right? And so about 1 to 3 meters is ideal for walleye. And so the really eutrophic systems can be less than 1 meter, where the really oligotrophic systems can be greater than 3 meters. And so again, it's really those mesotrophic systems where walleye tend to do the best, in part because of the turbidity and the clarity. Walleye are fairly robust to dissolved oxygen. They can handle less than or about 3 milligrams per liter for a period of time. But for the most part, they need about 5 milligrams per liter or more, which is pretty typical for most species outside of salmonids. For pH, 6 to 9, there is evidence that, below 6, when it's pretty acidic, that walleye reproduction can fail. They've seen this, with acid rain or mining issues. So just something to keep in mind if it happens to be an acidic system. That really can cause some problems. Physical habitat. I really like this paper by Kitchell et al. All the way back in 1977, where they pointed out that walleye tend to do best in lakes that are similar to large rivers. Okay, that's where walleye are native and very well adapted, is in these large rivers. And so lakes that have similar characteristics tend to be some of our most successful walleye lakes. They pointed out that those tend to be intermediate to larger, so 100 hectare or 250 acres and larger. Shallow to moderately deep, so about 3 to 10 meters is usually a pretty good depth. Also have extensive littoral and shoreline areas, and then have a combination of sand to larger gravel substrates, and often some submerged vegetation is valuable as well. In terms of physical habitat, the one we often focus on for eggs is coarse substrates. We'll talk about that some more in a bit. For larvae, for the most part, they're out in open water, but there's other aspects that we don't know too much about that larval stage. For the young, that's also not studied super well, but it seems like as they get a little bit larger, they move towards sand and vegetation areas, in part to feed on larger macroinvertebrates. The adults tend to associate with hard bottoms and also some sort of cover, whether it's vegetation, trees, or boulders. For species interactions, habitat is really a key factor, especially the thermal aspects and productivity. So going back to that Kitchell paper, the persids are shown in the grayed out area in the middle. Okay, and again, they're going to be most successful in those mesotrophic systems. Over to the left is the salmonids. They tend to be most successful in high latitude and oligotrophic systems. So the cold, low productivity, high dissolved oxygen. If we go to the right side, there we've got the Centrarchids and the cyprinids. So we've got the bass, the bluegill, and our minnows. They tend to do well in lower latitude areas, but especially those eutrophic systems. So warmer, higher productivity. With that in mind, lake size and depth are really important because they influence the habitat, but also they influence how many species you can actually even have in a system. Same with substrates and vegetation. These are all key aspects that sometimes go hand in hand with the overall water quality aspects. In general, studies have found that walleye tend to have positive associations with yellow perch and muskie. And they tend to have negative associations with bass, northern pike, and black crappie. What I'm gonna do now is move into different studies and really focusing especially on studies that looked at lots and lots of different lakes. So what we call a meta-analysis, where there's lots of data together, whether they collected it or it's from other studies, and did analyses that way. So meta-analysis, sometimes it's where somebody else collected the data. Some of these, they may have collected the data themselves. So that Kitchell paper that I've been referencing really focused heavily on this Johnson paper from 1977 as well. They looked at 2,500 lakes in Ontario, and we're trying to look at lake and water quality factors to group them into 15 different fish communities. They did an analysis with canonical discriminant analysis. So the ones I have highlighted are the ones that are kind of the walleye lakes. So W obviously stands for walleye, WP, walleye and pike, WPB, walleye, pike, and bass. What they found is some of those things that I've already mentioned as far as water quality, but also that walleye and pike did tend to be kind of coexist in intermediate to larger lakes, but not smaller lakes. One or the other tended to be present, and more often than not, it tended to be pike. I'm not going to go through their flow chart here, but it's really neat of how, this flow chart of you look at different habitat and water quality aspects, and it kind of derived what your species, your fish community would be like. And many of these things still hold true today. So really neat paper that, again, got a lot of things right. A more recent paper here in Wisconsin, Nate et al. Looked at 100 walleye lakes and really just looked at, 100 Wisconsin lakes and really just looked at presence or absence of walleye. What they found was that walleye tended to be present in lakes that were larger, deeper, wider, and had more sand and gravel than the non-walleye lakes. I do want to point out, though, that as far as especially the deeper part, we're still talking about relatively shallow in the grand scheme of things. Wisconsin has lots of lakes, but a number of our lakes are not, super deep and super large. They also looked a little bit closer at self-sustaining versus stocked lakes, and they found that the self-sustaining lakes for walleye, muskellunge tended to be more common, whereas the stocked lakes, there tended to be higher largemouth bass and northern pike populations. Moving over to Minnesota, Jacobson and Anderson looked at 500 Minnesota lakes, and we're doing correlations with the walleye catch per unit effort in their gill net surveys. And they again found that intermediate to larger lakes tended to be much more successful for walleye abundance. Shallow to intermediate depths were also tended to be where walleye were most successful. They also found a positive relationship with yellow perch, and not as strong, but a negative relationship with northern pike. Moving back up to Ontario, Van Zuiden and Sharma looked at 722 different lakes and did a principal component analysis. And they were looking at a variety of different things, such as lake and climate factors. And also their focus a lot was on walleye and smallmouth bass. The walleye grouped out towards the bottom of their graph. And one of the key factors, again, was area, where larger lakes tended to have, tended to be more of the walleye lakes. But also there was a relationship with the amount of precipitation in July, whereas July temperature, when it got warmer, tended to favor the bass and the bluegills. One more kind of large scale is Cross. He looked at almost 2,000 lakes in Minnesota. Again, looking at lake characteristics and the fish community using gill net data. He used a principal component analysis. There's a lot going on here. Let's just focus on walleye. Walleye are in the lower left quadrant, okay? And the walleye tended to be most common and highest abundance in clear, cool, forested, and deeper lakes. But at the same time, shallower and low flow and turbid with higher productivity. So it's this kind of combination, right? And so that's what some of these analyses are doing with all these multivariate. And so even though it says deep, it also is kind of and it also says shallow. So it's in some ways it's focusing a little bit more on those intermediate type depths. One thing to keep in mind in Minnesota is they have lots of large lakes. So a number of their lakes are 500 acres or larger. And again, a lot of these studies are finding that one of the most important parts is just the lake size. And so, kind of a rough cutoff is about 100 hectares and larger. Why is that? Well, one, it's just increased habitat diversity. You got a larger system, there's just going to be more options out there for habitat. But also these large lakes tend to have, intermediate to larger lakes tend to have larger fetches, which can be important for wind and wave activity to clear some of the shorelines for spawning, which we'll talk about in a little bit. In general, just more space and resources also means less competition. There's just more, space and resources to fill a variety of niches, including at times there may be what we call two-story fisheries, where there's kind of a warm water, upper zone where you got bass, and then there's a deeper zone that's cooler where you might have walleye or even some salmonids. I like this image just because it kind of shows that separation. We got the bass towards the surface in the epilimnion where there tends to be a lot of light, and the walleye are found in the thermocline where it's cooler and there is less light. Okay, and this is something that we see pretty regularly. So what's going on? Why are walleye kind of focused in that a little bit deeper zone? Well, if you look at that, again, it's temperature and light. The combination of these two is known as the Thermal-Optical habitat area, or TOHA. These are basically the areas where suitable thermal and optical ranges both occur. So the temperature is right and the light is right. This goes all the way back to Ryder in 1977, but there's been some pretty neat studies since then. Let's look at the paper by Hansen et al. So the amount of thermal optical habitat is shown in purple. It's going to be influenced by the thermal habitat, which is shown in red, and the blue, which is represented by the blue represents the optical habitat. Both of these factors are going to be influenced by day of year, right? And so temperature obviously goes through seasonality, but so does light. Light is influenced by daylight, but also by things like vegetation and phytoplankton. And so we know that one of the concerns is lakes warming up. What is that going to do as far as this thermal optical habitat? What a lot of modeling papers are actually finding is that the warmer temperatures are not initially the problem. That's actually increasing the thermal aspect of the thermal optical habitat. Okay, and so many of these lakes are not warming up to the extent that it's lethal, and in some ways the warming up can actually benefit walleye. The bigger problem appears to be the increasing water clarity. What that's going to do is it's going to, as water clarity increases, it's going to drive the walleye deeper. And so therefore, there's just going to be less area for them to occupy that meets their criteria. So the question is, well, what in the world is increasing water clarity? Well, one is actually a good thing in that a lot of systems are getting cleaned up from just better land management practices. Septic systems, fewer of those, or less nutrients in general getting into systems. And, this can also be tied to things like different legislation. That's one aspect. But another big one that's not as natural or not going back to maybe what it used to be is the presence of dreissynid mussels. So zebra mussels and quagga mussels, where they are filter feeding like crazy and actually clearing up our lake systems. And so the combination of these, sometimes we actually see, we're used to eutrophication of systems, but some systems are actually becoming more oligotrophic. So within this paper, going back to Mille, so we already saw the graph on the upper right of how age 3 walleye are declining over time. Age 3 and older are declining over time. And when we look at the thermal optical habitat, that's on the bottom in purple. We see a really pretty strong correlation. But you'll notice that it's not the temperature that's driving that decline. Temperature actually suggests that the thermal conditions have improved over time. It's really that optical habitat. It's becoming clear, and that seems like why there's this reduction in thermal optical habitat, and the overall correlation is pretty strong. Now, we do have to keep in mind that there's other things that are going on as well in these systems. And so this graph shows the abundance of northern pike and smallmouth bass over time. Pike have always been there, and maybe they've been increasing a little bit since the 1990s, but it's really those smallmouth bass that are starting to take off. And we're going to talk about this some more, maybe what's going on with bass and walleye in a little bit. So recruitment, as mentioned, recruitment can mean lots of different things. And this particular paper was focused on age 0 recruitment. So in Wisconsin, what we do, the DNR goes out and samples in the fall using electrofishing and focusing on age 0s. If they get 10 per mile or more, that's considered a successful recruitment year. Less than that is considered poor or a failure. That's what Hansen and others et al. Did in their paper. That was their response variable, a successful year or not. They had almost 3,000 different surveys to work with from over 500 Wisconsin lakes, and they had 46 different lake predictors. They wanted to focus on things that are relatively consistent over time. And so these are kind of lake-wide predictors that shouldn't be too variable from year to year. Not too surprising, but we're going back to area, right? And so lake area had a positive relationship with whether or not there would be a successful recruitment in a given year. Small lakes, it's pretty variable. Only about 20 to 30% of the time will you have a successful recruitment year. Whereas large lakes, it's about 50-50. About 50% of the time you could have a successful year. The other one was degree days. So degree days is basically this accumulation of temperature over a growing season. And not too surprising, but when it's cooler, there's going to be a better success for walleye recruitment in the fall compared to when it's warmer. A new paper that came out just not too long ago was looking at recruitment success in a little bit different way. And so they looked at year class strength by analyzing data from ages 1 to 3. So they kind of looked at not just age 0s, not just 1, but all the way through 3. And that was their metric. And, you know, it was actually a year class strength. It wasn't just a failure or not. They focused on the 9 large Minnesota lakes. So we're talking about their big lakes. They focused on that. So that kind of took out some of the small lake aspect. They had 30 different years of data to work with, and they looked at 17 different variables. These were biotic, abiotic, and also some stocking information. What they found here, this is just showing which variables were the most important, not necessarily the effect of those variables, but which were most important. And the 2 that really stuck out were degree days in their first year of life. What was interesting here, though, is actually the opposite of what they found in the Wisconsin paper, where cooler years actually were the more successful years for developing a year class strength. But again, keep in mind, this is in large lakes, where the Wisconsin one was more in smaller to intermediate lakes. The other strong influencer was winter severity. And so this is just for their first year. So as they're going through their first winter, severe winters have a negative effect on their overall year class strength compared to mild winters. So speaking of recruitment, let's kind of take a step back and look at the spawning habitat aspects. So some of the historical papers were pretty spot on with what we know now, that walleye tend to spawn in shallow, windswept, coarse shorelines. Their survival tends to be highest on coarse substrates and lower on fine substrates. Successful years tended to be with stable water levels, rising water temperatures, and moderate wave activity. So again, these were great papers. They just were not overly quantitative on certain aspects. And this is actually where I focused my master's research at UW-Stevens Point. I studied just one lake, Big Crooked Lake in northern Wisconsin. It's kind of an intermediate size at 276 hectares. A nice aspect is it has very limited development because it's a private lake. And what we did was looked for where walleye were spawning, which we call used habitat, and compared that to the available habitat. So as soon as the ice melted, I got in the lake and snorkeled to find where the walleye were depositing their eggs. And in 2005, I snorkeled the entire lake, noting where the walleye eggs were found, which is shown in black. We also compared that to the available habitat, which we analyzed, we collected data on. That's shown in gray. What I found was that walleye spawned over about 1.2 kilometers of the shoreline, which was 39% of the coarse substrate. So when we look at the area, it was only 10% of the coarse substrate area. Okay. Why was that? Well, walleye were spawning really close to shore, but also because they weren't using all of this coarse substrate, they were selecting for certain habitats. So what we did was we used the used versus available habitat and ran resource selection functions and found that indeed walleye tend to deposit their eggs close to shore and in shallow water over gravel and cobble. And they tend to avoid areas where there's lots of fine organic material. In fact, about 5% or more, and we hardly ever found walleye eggs. Sand was kind of the interesting one. Some sand is fine, but if you get very high sand percentage, you're not likely to find walleye eggs. This model was actually validated in 2 northern Wisconsin lakes by Lauren Williamson. I think it's helpful to kind of visualize what's going on. And so I actually made a 3-dimensional graph of where walleye are spawning. And so the light area with no lines, that's the riparian habitat. The dark lake part is the coarse substrates, and the lighter colored is the fine substrates. The red represents where walleye were actually depositing their eggs. So it was mighty close to shore. And again, there was some of that reef that was left in deeper water further from shore that they were not using. At this same spot, I actually went out every single morning and marked where recently deposited eggs were. So walleye eggs are initially adhesive. And that's what all the white dots are. And so again, right away, walleye are spawning close to shore, in shallow water, and over gravel and cobble. However, we did find that walleye were spawning in some sandy areas. So if we look in this inset here, the white dots were in entirely sandy areas. What I did then is I also went out after spawning was done, and that's the hashed marks. So the walleye eggs were still there after spawning. However, I went out one more time closer to hatching, and now the eggs were no longer in that location. And so we found is that eggs are moving, especially moving off of sand substrates, and in general tend to move towards shore. And so wind and wave activity is really important. And going back to that Kitchell paper, one of it is, hey, rivers have flow, right? And near the shoreline, that's some similar to river conditions where there's actually water movement. And so this wave activity is important because it helps to clear fine materials and provides dissolved oxygen to the eggs. However, it also can transport eggs and move substrates. So as we saw in my study, there were eggs that were being moved onto shore in waves. They were getting buried. And we had a velocity meter out there, and we found that the wave velocity during the incubation season was sufficient to move eggs 39% of the time, sand 30% of the time, but gravel only 4% of the time, and larger substrates basically not at all. So a lab study by Crane and Farrell found that coarse gravel actually retains eggs better than very large coarse gravel. So you think about if there's boulders or cobble or rubble, excuse me, that can actually allow eggs to get wiped out better than that gravel alone. A recent study by Gatch and others found that egg survival in a lab study was low when covered in silt and actually relatively high when covered in sand. So sand alone by itself isn't necessarily bad, but obviously the eggs do have to hatch and also get out of the sand, which could be a problem. And again, that sand does not retain eggs very well. So the studies that Lauren and myself did were very focused on one or two lakes. And with the Minnesota DNR and a grad student, Doug Zentner, we wanted to be much broader. And so we looked at 28 lakes in Minnesota across 3 years. And rather than snorkeling the whole lake, we just looked at transects and looked at, were there eggs present or not? And if they were present, where was the high egg deposition areas? So Doug collected all sorts of data from these transects, the quadrats, but also from the lakes themselves. And he ran some of these pretty complex models, and we were able to look at variable importance. And what's kind of neat is with this big scale study, a lot of the same things held true. Distance to shore is really important. Silt and clay, sand, those have negative relationships with walleye egg deposition, and gravel had a positive relationship. But Doug was also able to develop this classification tree where now lake associations and biologists could use this to go to spots and help determine whether or not there's likely to be egg deposition in a little bit different way than the resource selection functions that I developed. So if we just go up to the very top part, let's say we go to a spot and the transect has more than 14% silt and clay, very likely to not find eggs there. If there is less than 14%, then what about sand? Lots of sand, probably not going to find eggs. Okay, so then these ones are where there's going to be more of that coarse substrate, and that's where distance and even lake characteristics can come into play. What about early life? We don't know a ton about early life. And so the larvae in general tend to be demersal, where initially they may stay in the rocks for a few days, but then they drift or swim and are out in the pelagic zone. What Bohm and others found in some Wisconsin lakes by sampling extensively over 4 years was that from mid-May to mid-June, they were finding walleye in the pelagic zone using some plankton toes. July, they sampled using micromesh gill nets, and they were finding walleye in nearshore areas with lakes that had recruitment, but they were absent in lakes declining recruitment. And so it seems like somewhere in that summer is when the walleye are dropping out as far as that first year. So Pratt and Fox actually did visual observations where they got in the water, and they found that in early summer, young walleye were in about 2 to 5 meters of water and tended to associate with macrophytes and areas with lots of other prey fishes. By late summer, they were relatively shallow, about 0 to 2 meters, and in medium to high macrophyte areas. For the juveniles and adults, somewhat surprisingly, there haven't been too many detailed studies on these, but we do know where they are from fishing, from sampling efforts, etc. And some tagging studies have shown that they do have relatively large seasonal movements where they move to spawn and overwinter. And then, from late spring through fall, they tend to have relatively small home ranges that are going to be influenced a lot by that thermal-optical habitat. So because of their light sensitivity, during the day, they're either going to be deeper or in some type of cover, whereas at night, they move into the shallows to feed. So a study that I'm helping out with is on Sanford Lake, where we're doing daytime radio telemetry and also have pit antennas along the shore. And the radio telemetry reveals that during the day, walleye tend to be associated with macrophytes and rock bars, and also we're using a fish crib. At night, we started to pick them up at our pit antennas. So it just kind of showed that, yes, they are moving inshore at nighttime. So what about these species interactions? First off is prey. Walleye, when they first feed, they feed on zooplankton. And there's some concerns. Well, maybe there's shifts in zooplankton abundance or timing. And that's where we're trying to do some research on that here at Stevens Point. But then they shift to large invertebrates and fish. What about competitors? At the young stages, there's lots of competitors, right? As adults, it's mainly going to be those other top predators, the bass, the pike, and the muskie. As far as the predators, it doesn't seem like there's lots of direct predation on walleye. There might be some bass and pike feeding on smaller walleye, but in general, that doesn't seem like the main effect as far as why sometimes bass and pike are more successful. It's not like they're just eating all of them. It's likely a competition or a habitat issue. And again, these species interactions are really dependent on lake size and conditions. What we're seeing is some contrasting trends in walleye and bass over the last, relatively recently here. So going back to that Van Zuiden and Sharma paper, they looked at Ontario lakes on lakes that had walleye only, smallmouth bass only, or those that coexisted. They found for the lakes where there was coexistence that walleye abundance was higher in lakes that had no bass versus lakes that had bass present. Using some modeling approaches with estimated increases in water temperature, they found that by 2050, there could be a 246% increase in co-occurrence of bass and smallmouth bass, and that walleye likely are going to shift north and have lower abundance overall. Moving back to Wisconsin, this is where we're currently at. Wisconsin lakes, there's only about 184 that are walleye dominant. There are 41 where they coexist with largemouth bass. Bass are dominant in lots of our lakes. Based on predicted temperatures moving towards mid-century, only about 25 lakes in Wisconsin would be dominant by walleye. There would be an increase in coexistence, but there's going to be a big shift for bass dominance. Even worse by the end of the century, where we could be down to potentially only 17 lakes where walleye would be dominant. So what's going on here? Again, keep in mind the increasing temperatures can actually benefit walleye for a period of time, but it appears like it benefits bass more. And so that's the concern, that the bass are getting, a stronghold and benefiting from the warmer temperatures because they're a warm water species. And that can just aid them as being even stronger competitors. So what can we do to manage walleye? This is obviously a huge question and I don't have all the answers, but regulations, they can be effective, right? We just have to keep in mind that there's temporal and spatial variability in terms of where certain regulations are effective, and they're going to really depend on what the anglers and other harvesters are doing. Stocking, introductions have been very successful, but supplemental is pretty variable. I'll talk about that in a second. Something that we've been trying here in Wisconsin is to remove certain species. And so there's been a positive response with removing lakes where bullheads got really dominant. It's proven very challenging with trying to remove Centrarchidae. They seem to persist and there hasn't been a strong response with the walleye. And so really, again, let's focus on the habitat. It's a longer term solution, but we have to continue to learn. So look at the water quality. Is it suitable? Is it optimal? Do you think that's potentially limiting or is it potentially changing? Unfortunately, water quality, as you know, is really challenging to manage. We can try to work on the riparian, but lots of times we have to work at a watershed level. And some of the climate aspects are just totally out of our hands. Physical habitat, let's consider all of the life stages. So spawning, we know that shoreline protection is really important because they're spawning literally right on shore. And so that's a very vulnerable area. There's been an idea of, well, let's put in artificial reefs. And these have been used, but there's been limited increases in recruitment. Potentially, there were some, incorrect aspects of those reefs, but also possibly spawning habitat was not the limiting factor. For coarse woody habitat, the location is a big aspect. And is it a benefit, or is it just going to aggregate for anglers where, let's say you put a fish crib in and now they know where to fish for them? Macrophytes, to varying extent, it seems important, but we don't really know what's their preferred types. And so that's an area for further research. So I really think we should focus on the right lakes and protecting them. So look at the habitat, look at the community. Again, focus on cool water lakes that are mesotrophic, that are larger, that have intermediate depth and clarity, that have extensive shorelines and coarse substrates, and that are not already dominated by salmonids, centrarchids, or northern pike. And really look, are the conditions changing? Are there limiting factors? And use available tools that are out there for you. So Wisconsin DNR recently developed this flexible lake classification system that managers can use to look at. And one of the first things they did was just looked at the sport fish community. If it's really simple, where there's not many sport fish and no walleye, that's one group, compared to complex. And from there, then they looked at temperature, clarity, and hydrology. And they were able to, look at all these lakes and group them into these different lake classifications. And based on that, you can see, would walleye likely be successful? So if it's a warm system, they're probably not going to be successful. If it's a clear system, if it's a simple system. So focus on those complex, cooler systems, including ones that may have a riverine connection or are a little bit deeper. Minnesota has something similar, okay, where they've looked at ecoregions as one aspect, then they've looked at temperature, area, and all those type of things. And so a great paper or a great resource where you can kind of look and see, this has water clarity as well. A lot of these things that we've talked about, there's data available on those at the lake level, which can help you out. Another big thing that's helping out is technology. So side scan sonar is now allowing us to rapidly look at substrates and macrophytes. GIS is awesome. We can look at characteristics of lakes. We can model temperatures. We can even predict substrates. So a paper that Doug worked on was looking at, hey, let's take these different aspects, just GIS layers. We can actually predict the substrates without even leaving our office to relatively accurate. So habitat, what's going on with the larvae? The young, there's still lots of areas of research, and the adults, including that, that correlation with the thermal-optical habitat. For spawning habitat, I think there's still questions of how much physical habitat is needed. And does that physical habitat influence recruitment? Richter found from his few lakes that there wasn't a real strong correlation between recruitment and habitat. A really cool study right now with Levi Simons is we're actually using genetics. So we're sampling the adults, we're sampling the eggs and the young to see who's being the most successful and potentially is that habitat related. I think there's room to look at more of those annual effects, the wind and wave, the temperature, the water levels, and the ice scour. Finally, let's use that new technology, the side scan sonar, the GIS, but also some of our tags nowadays. We can monitor the temperature and even the light of some of these tagged fish. So I think really cool areas for future research. But also sometimes we might have to go to do some more controlled studies where maybe we try removals or we try different aspects, but also maybe bring it to a little bit smaller scale and work at, in a mesocosm or lab experiments. So I apologize, I'm going a little bit longer than I expected, but what about stocking? So stocking, number one, avoid stocking just to stock. There's times where lake associations or angler groups will pay for it, but it's expensive and there's ecological and genetic issues to be considered of. Don't stock just to stock. So introductory stockings have been quite successful, but it's pretty mixed to poor otherwise. So there's lots of analyses that have found that when you try to stock on top of a walleye population, it's only about a 5% success rate. Success does tend to be higher with larger fingerlings than smaller fingerlings or fry. However, the larger fingerlings are going to cost a lot more than something like fry. Okay. And sometimes you could stock fry more of them or more frequently, and you could hit in certain years. And so there's lots of things going on with stocking. But definitely consider the genetics, the transportation, and the conditions at release. And also consider the rate and frequency of stocking. How much do you stock and how often? But number one, hopefully, is it really a walleye lake? Okay, and let's walk through that. So I think a first question is, has there been walleye there in the past? Okay, if yes, is the population naturally recruiting and self-sustaining? If yes, we suggest just leaving it alone. Focus on the habitat and the fish community. It's probably not worth stocking on top of it. If no, if there are some problems with recruitment, does the system have suitable habitat? So look at the temperature, look at the water quality, and look at the habitat. If no, probably shouldn't be stocking there. If yes, who's already there? Who are the competitors or the predators? If there's a lot of other competitors and predators, maybe stocking's not the best option again. If there's not many other competitors or predators, what about prey? Is prey, is there abundant prey? If no, again, probably shouldn't stock. If yes, then you should stock. So what about stocking? For fry, about 500 to 2,000 per acre has been shown to be successful. Small fingerlings, 50 to 100 per acre. Large fingerlings, about 10 to 30 per acre, or about half a pound per littoral acre. And so there's lots of research on stocking that's out there. Again, it can be highly variable, but there are things you can do to improve it. So again, a lot of this is simply from a paper that we worked on, in part because of the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership asked us to do a presentation and then a paper. I'd be happy to share that with anybody that doesn't have access to it. So I'd be happy to take any questions for those that want to stick around. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Dr. Raabe, for a comprehensive overview of walleye and their habitat requirements. I'll remind people that there is the Q&A button on the screen. So if you have questions that you want to present to our speaker, please enter them now and we will pose them to him. I've got a couple for you right now, so I think we can just jump into a couple questions. The first question is back at something you mentioned earlier on in the talk about the impact of severe winters on walleye recruitment. Do you have any idea how they determined what was a severe winter? Was that temperature or duration or related to ice cover? Do you know what they were talking about there specifically?
Well, that's a great question. I don't remember offhand. Again, that's a newer paper that actually wasn't included in our paper. I wanted to include it. Wisconsin does have metrics for that, and it tends to be a combination of temperature and ice cover. I don't know for Minnesota exactly what that is. And so sometimes there's actually, it's not even necessarily something they derive. There's actually severity indexes that are out there already for, just the climate aspect. And a concern there is we've experienced, some pretty, in some ways, temperature is warming up, but also we have these really extreme events in the winter. I know a lot of us have lived through of the, the polar vortexes and stuff like that. So I don't know offhand exactly what they used for the criteria in their paper. That was for Minnesota, so I apologize. I don't know quite offhand, but it's in their paper.
All right, thank you. Another question that gets at definition, but this one is one that applies directly to your work. How do you define a naturally recruiting and self-sustaining population?
Yeah, so obviously that can mean a lot of different things. That's a great question. And for Wisconsin, that definition is determined by surveys, by the biologist surveys. And so are there, walleye that are continuing to be found in their surveys, especially when there's not stocking occurring. And so for me personally, again, are you seeing that there is walleye that are reproducing and appear to be, continuing on their own without, any need for stocking? And that obviously can vary. It really depends on what you consider, as self-sustaining, but especially the extent of what's a good walleye lake. There are a number of lakes where they've continued to reproduce. It's just at a very low level. And so technically those lakes are still, I would consider, successfully self-sustaining, but at naturally low levels. And so it's really one where it's a hard criteria. Again, the Wisconsin DNR does the 10 walleye per mile as a successful recruitment year, but also 3 adults per acre or more is considered a successful walleye lake in Wisconsin, at least.
Thank you. All right, we've got a couple questions related to invasive species. One's just general to see if you have thoughts about invasive species impacts on walleye in general, but maybe first you can address a more specific question. Are you aware whether spiny water flea has been documented as having negative effects on walleye recruitment?
Yeah, so that recent paper in Minnesota that looked at walleye year class strength did include that. And it was not one of the strong variables. So it is out there. It is an area of research. Obviously, they're a zooplankton that's really not available for consumption because of their large size and are competing with other zooplankton. So that's the only paper that I know of. And again, I'm just not quite as familiar with that paper by Hansley et al. That looked at the 9 large Minnesota lakes, but they were looking at the spiny water flea directly. It was not one of the strongest factors, but also I don't know if it was in all 9 of their large lakes. And obviously, there's lots of factors from year to year that can also influence. And so that's the only one that I know of that's looked at it directly. I know there's some other work down in the Madison area that are trying to look at the spiny water flea, but that's kind of preliminary at the moment.
Thanks. And then to follow up on that, to the more general question of other invasive species, is there any work indicating that there's other species, whether it's zooplankton or plants or fish, that may be competing with walleye?
Sure. Well, a big one is that light, as I mentioned. That's one where there's been correlations with as the dry-sended mussels clear up lakes, we're seeing a negative response for the walleye because of that increased clarity. And so that's been shown in some studies and anecdotally in other systems. As far as some others in Green Bay, there's round gobies, and walleye are feeding extensively on the round gobies. And so it's actually been a positive in some ways, but round gobies are known to be egg predators, and so there's obviously that concern. With the macrophytes, obviously we got lots of milfoil. And if that really takes over systems, walleye in general don't like the really dense macrophytes, and neither do the adult bass. And so if they get really extensive, where you get those big mats, that tends to be a negative for walleye, although there's not been too many studies that looked at that directly.
Right, thank you. Another question, a different kind of question. Do stocked walleye spawn at the same success rate as natural walleye? And if they have a lesser reproductive rate, could stocking fish actually hurt the population?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that the Minnesota DNR has been looking at. And so they looked at it genetically. Lauren Miller's the geneticist. And what he found was that some of the northern fish that were stocking in the south were not being successful. And I can't remember if it was vice versa too, but they definitely found that there was some difference in the strain, that some of the populations were not being as successful when they were crossed across water boundaries. Obviously in many of systems, walleye have been stocked everywhere. And, originally there wasn't much concern for the genetic aspect. And that's made some challenges as far as, looking at who's successful or not. But the main way to look at that has been genetics. And there has been some results that have shown that certain strains aren't going to be as successful, and it does appear to be a local adaptation. The main one I can think of is from Lauren Miller.
All right. Another question for you. You described a lot of different lake characteristics that relate to walleye presence and absence and habitat suitability. Do you think, in your opinion, are we generally quite good at collecting data and long-term monitoring data that is useful for those kind of studies, or are there other variables that you wish you had richer data sets about that could be useful in understanding walleye and walleye management?
Obviously, you can always use more data. That's never a question. I do think, especially now, including these different lake partnerships, that data is getting more and more available. I think historically, sometimes we base it off of 1 or 2 data points. And so some of those are pretty stable, and others, potentially could be changing over time. And so I personally haven't done any of those larger analyses. They would, only use lakes that they felt had good data. And as you can see, they still had quite a few lakes in a number of those analyses. But I do think, just as we collect more and more data moving forward, it's always gonna be helpful, because some of those, again, were based off of, a Secchi disc 1 year, and it could be totally different another year, or not totally, but a little bit different. A lot of the temperatures are actually modeled temperatures, not actual real, collected data, which obviously were built with actual data, but it was modeled temperatures for a number of those systems. So I do think now we have lots of it data. I do think historically it was a little bit more limited, although certain lakes have been collecting that data, consistently.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And somehow magically we've ended up at the bottom of the hour, and that was our last question. So
Okay.
I want to thank you again, Dr. Raabe, for joining us today for this webinar on walleye. It had a really great attendance. So thank you also to all the attendees for joining us today. As we mentioned at the top of the talk, we are recording, and we'll post this on the MGLP website in about a week. So you can look for it there if you want to share it or look back to it to review what you learned here today. But otherwise, thank you so much. We hope to see you all at our next webinar.